So welcome back to part 2 of the story of John in Noble Purpose. We ended part 1 with how the family moved out to the western part of the city after Anna's funeral. And they developed new friendships, both Ricky and John did. And they created a new life there. And so as John became 19, he worked for the public service company, and he was a meter reader. So one day he stopped to get the books that he needed, so he would go kind of know where to go and which meters to read. And there was a police officer that showed up right behind his car, and he thought, oh no, what happened here? And the police officer asked for his license and registration, and of course he gave it to him. And the man looked at it, and he said, are you the son of, and he named his father's name. And he said, yes, I am. And he said, he took his ticket, tore it in half, and he said, I know your father. He says, I used to work for your father before I became a police officer. He said, would you be interested in going on some rides with me? Because your dad tells me you'd like to become a police officer. And John said, of course, I would love to. So what happened with them was that John's parents actually babysat for this police officer's kids when they were small. So they had a great relationship to start with. And he went for 2 years, almost 2 years straight, on every weekend, nearly every weekend, he went on rides with this police officer who was, his precinct was downtown. And he said he saw things that he never expected to see. And he says it was a human circus, and he just would kind of laugh about it. I said, did that cause you to think anything about not wanting to be it? He says, no, I wanted to be a police officer even more. He says it was exciting, it was thrilling, it was interesting. So when he was 21, he was able to apply for jobs, because you had to be 21 in order to to be able to apply for a police officer position. And he applied all over. And he did get an interview with Boulder, and they invited him in. And during the oral panels, they said, you're so squeaky clean. And he says, well, what do you mean by that? And he says, we'd love to hire you, but you have no experience. He said, well, how can I have any experience if nobody's going to hire me? Well, they didn't hire him. And so he went on and applied elsewhere, and did apply in Denver. Didn't get the job the first year, but you could only apply once a year. And so a year later, he then applied again, and then he was accepted. He passed everything he had to do in order to get into the police force. And then he also went on to get into the academy, which is a 4-month period of time where they learned all these different things within the academy. And then 4 months after that, he was on kind of like in a probationary period where they had an officer that was always with him, and they would make reports about how he managed everything that he did. And then he was on his own after that, and then he graduated. And so during his graduation, all these friends that he had developed out there in the western part of the city where his family had moved to, he developed these incredibly lovely friendships, and they all showed up at his graduation. And as a gift, they gave him a little gift box, and inside it was a bullet. And it was kind of reminiscent of Barney Fife, and Barney Fife always carried a bullet in his pocket. Never the bullet in his gun, but always the bullet in his pocket on the Andy Griffith Show. So it was just kind of a funny little gift, and he still has it today. So he went about his life becoming a police officer because he was so inspired by the police officers that were so inspirational and so helpful and so kind of how they were with his family for that month of when Anna was missing. And so he wanted to be the same kind of police officer, and he just calls them cops. He wanted the same kind of cop. So I'm going to tell you different stories. They're not necessarily in order of how they all happened, but these are how I'm remembering it as I'm telling it. So there was one time he and one of his partners at the time, they were on the eastern part of their jurisdiction, and there was an apartment that was on fire. Tried to get into the front. This is at night, and they tried to get in the front door, and it was locked. You had to have a key to get in. So they ran out of the back of the building, and luckily enough, the door was ajar. So they were able to get in, but there was so much smoke in the building, they had to crawl on their bellies to get from door to door and to get people out of the building safely. They went from door to door, from floor to floor, and they got people out. And one door was locked, and they couldn't get it open. And somebody said there was an elderly woman that lived there. So he got up on his feet and kicked the door in, and she had passed out. She was in the middle of the floor. So he picked her up, and he said, by then his adrenaline was really high, and he said he didn't even think about how heavy she was or anything. He just picked her up, and as he turned around, the doorway was completely covered in that blue flame, which is the hottest flames, of course. And he said just for a split second, he thought, oh my goodness, isn't that beautiful? And he said, of course, that was just a real instant moment, and he carried her through that door of blue flames and got her outside, and he left her with a lot of the other people and said, once the paramedics get here, make sure that they take care of her right away. And he and this other police officer kept going in because the fire department hadn't arrived yet, and so they just kept going in, and they went from door to door again, and some people were afraid to leave, and they had to escort them out to make sure they were safe. And so they got everybody out. Everyone was safe. And they both had to be put into the hospital to make sure, for their smoke inhalation. And they had to do tests to make sure that they didn't have any of the chemicals in their body. But they were fine, and they both received accommodation for doing what they did, and they saved people's lives. They went on to situations like there was a call with a woman who called in and said, oh, my friend is in danger. Can you please call on her? So this was one of the older apartment buildings in the Capitol Hill area, which was their jurisdiction. And they went in and got in the doorway. And just as they opened the door, a woman came running out, and she was completely nude. And they thought, well, what the heck is going on? And she was screaming about her baby and said, he's got my baby, he's got my baby. And so they went in to discover that there was a man there, and by that time he had gone to the back bedroom, back into the corner behind a bed, right in the corner, and he had a hold of this little baby and a butcher knife, threatening to kill the baby if they didn't let him go. So there were 4 police officers, of which John was one of them, and they said, they all had their guns drawn, and but they didn't want to use it because they were so fearful that they would harm the baby. And so John put his gun in his holster. He jumped on the bed. He grabbed the knife out of the man's hand, threw it on the floor, and grabbed the baby. And I don't know how he could have done that, but he did. And there are people to say that, yes, he did. And so then he told the other 3 officers to arrest this man, and so they did. They found out that the woman who had run out of the apartment, that he had raped her, and then he tried to drown her in the bathtub, and that's why she ran out like she did. And a neighbor had brought a blanket to put around her, and they also received accommodation for that as well. There's so many different calls that they made. There was one that the storms were just horrendous, like it can be sometimes, where you can hardly drive because the snow is so deep and it's storming so much. And they were called on a high-rise down in the downtown area, and there was a DOA. So they had to go in and make a report on this person who had passed so that the coroner could come in and take the body away. So they went back into the car and let they reported in to the dispatcher to say, hey, we're on duty again. Where do we need to go next? And the dispatch said, the same building that you're at, there's an OB. There's a woman having a baby, so you need to go back in. So they went back into the same building, and they helped this woman have her baby. So one person died, and one person was born pretty much at the same time, and they were there for both of those experiences to support those people on their journeys. And so there were just so many different stories like this. There was a time they went down into an apartment because there was a big party, and people had reported that this party needed to stop, making so much noise, and they were going to just pretty much say, you got to stop the party, it's time to let it go. But there was a young man there with a gun, and he was just kind of playing around, and he was surprised to see the police there. And they weren't quite sure what they were going to have to do, because there were so many situations like that where they just would kind of come across someone that you had to make these instant decisions. Well, they were able to talk the guy, to put his gun down, and they ended the party, and that was that. There was nothing that happened from it. That was horrific. There was a time where they were put on a call where someone called and he said, I've hurt this man and I need you to come and take care of him. And they got there and the man was bleeding. And what had happened is this man that was bleeding had tried to sexually assault the younger man, and the younger man wasn't going to have anything to do with it. And the closest thing that he had near him was a machete, and he took a machete and hit the other guy in the head. So when they did arrive, the machete wasn't in the man's head, but he was bleeding profusely. So John grabbed a blanket, or no, it wasn't. It was a coat that was nearby on a coat hanger, wrapped it around the man's head to try and keep him, from bleeding as much as he possibly could until paramedics were able to get there. And they did. They got him there, got him to the hospital. But they found out that the man had AIDS. And this was back in the 90s, and John had to wait for 6 months to find out if he had contracted the virus, of which he did not. He had no open sores, and so he was safe. But for 6 months, he wasn't sure what was going to happen. And it was just story after story after story like this of what he became a part of, and things that he did with a lot of his partners, that they were involved in different things like this. There were calls like when they had opportunities to connect with someone who perhaps could not be, the hospital couldn't reach them when there was supposed to be they were going to have a transplant, and let's just say it was a liver transplant, and it was time. They had the liver, it was time to do the transplant. They couldn't get a hold of the person, so they called in the police, and the police would go in, and so John and his partners would go in to find this person and say, hey, we're trying to get a hold of you, and they would escort the people sometimes to the hospital. And they did receive a letter from someone that said, you are some of the people that helped save my life. Thank you so much. And so they did, and I said, I didn't know you did things like that. He said, we did all kinds of different things, and it's just really astounding what they all did. So there are lots of stories like that, but the biggest story was Columbine. John had been about halfway through his career at that time, and he was also training to be on the SWAT team. And so his first wife, his former wife, called him and said, I think you better find out what's going on, because there's something going on in Columbine. So he did get a hold of his commander, and he said, yep, suit up and come on in. And so he showed up there, and there were challenges because there were so many jurisdictions involved. There were so many there was Lakewood Police, there was Jefferson County Police, and there was also Denver, and there were fire departments from all over as well, because nobody knew what was going on for such a long time, and they were all trying to figure out how to manage all this. So at first, he was set up on a hill. They were all set up there in case they had to, they didn't know if they were just ready with their guns ready to see if they were going to have to take anybody out. They weren't sure what was going on. Then they were brought in just as there was a ambulance that was right next to the school, and as kids were brought out and teachers were brought out, some were brought out to the ambulances, and they were there to kind of help manage all of that. And that was also the place where all of the students and the teachers were brought out, and then they were then escorted across the street to the elementary school, where they would remain until their families would come and pick them up. So they were there until the school was completely evacuated, and then the people who were on the SWAT team itself went in first, and then the people who were in training, like he was, went in second right afterwards. And then they went in, the people in training were the ones that wrote all the reports about the things that they saw and the things that they witnessed. There were things that these little devices that these two young men, these two young boys who were the perpetrators there at Columbine, they created this thing called crickets. They were made with matches, and he said it was just astounding that they had so many of them, and they just carried them in a duffel bag, evidently, that it was astounding that they didn't rub together and blow themselves up in a car on the way to the school, because they were really that volatile. But they put holes into the walls, and they put these inside the walls along with a stack of matches, a stack of napkins, and then everything would burn. So there were fires all over the place. There were smoke everywhere. and they were able to kind of figure out what was going on, and then they did end up in the library where so many of the other students were killed, including the two boys that ended up killing themselves. So it was horrific, just to say the very least. And so after they found out everything that's going on there, then they went back to the grade school that was across the street, and they were there as all the students were cordoned off and the teachers as well, and they already had police, psychiatrists, and other people like that there to support people already. And I do know a number of organizations and people that also supported them for a number of months and even a couple years afterwards to support the families and the students and the teachers in their ability to be able to move past and move through what had happened that horrific day. He said he remembered one woman that was there to pick up her child. And it was a long time after all the other students were picked up, and this one woman, and he locked eyes, and he realized that this woman probably would not see her child alive. And he said he will never forget her face, just like he would never forget the things he saw there that day, as he would never forget so much of what he experienced in those years as a police officer. So he did these amazing things. And here's another amazing thing about this. And his brother became a police officer just a couple of years later after he joined the Denver Police Department. They both worked for the same precinct. His brother became a sergeant, and John ended up continuing to be on patrol because he loved meeting the people. He loved the different challenges that he had every day. It was exciting. He never knew what he was going to come up against. And I asked him, I said, was there ever a time where you thought this was too much and you just couldn't do this? And he said, no, I never, ever thought that. He said, every single day I started out my day with, may I be of service to whoever I come across. And if there's something I can do, may I do it well. And may I come home safely and for yet another day. And at that time, he was married to who he's married to now. And who he's dedicated to is his family, to his wife, to his brother, to all of his nephews, and all of his uncle, and his mom, who's still alive. And his father passed away about 20 years ago. But his brother and he are still so dedicated to their mother and doing everything they do to support her. And he speaks about the strength of who she is. And she's an astounding woman. I've met her, and she's really, really an amazing woman. Everyone in his family is. And so I'm going to end this tonight with that particular story to just say to you how astounding John is, how astounding his brother Rick is, how police officers all over the place and fire department and the people in military service, people that serve us in this way, do things that we just never have any idea. And they live with noble purpose, and how glorious and how incredible they are. I've had so many experiences with so many of them, and I am honored to know them. And so tonight's story is the end of that. Tomorrow I will tell you the story of John and some of the funny things that he experienced, just to end this in a good note. And so good night for now.